War Machine was killed to start an argument between two white heroes. A scientist was buried across 38 plots because no one bothered to shrink his corpse. A teenager was beaten nearly to death in prison after being convicted despite video evidence of his innocence. One hero died saving the kids who bullied him, and another was crucified on the Xavier Mansion lawn. And Marvel gave it 3 pages. There's a pattern here, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. When Marvel needs a death that matters but a character they can afford to lose, they reach for the same roster every time. James Rhodes. If you've watched the MCU, you already know James Rhodes. Don Cheadle has played him across over a dozen films as War Machine, Iron Patriot, and Tony Stark's best friend, making him one of the most recognizable black superheroes in pop culture. Marvel killed him to start an argument. To understand how this happened, you have to look at what Civil War II was trying to accomplish in 2016. The event needed a death in its opening pages, something to prove the stakes were real, and give Tony Stark and Captain Marvel a reason to go to war. Writer Brian Michael Bendis needed a character beloved enough that readers would feel the loss, but not so central that the death would derail Marvel's publishing plans. Rhodes fit both criteria perfectly, and that's exactly the problem. James Rhodes had been in comics since 1979. He was the first person other than Tony Stark to wear the Iron Man armor full-time. Not as a fill-in, but as the actual Iron Man for years while Stark battled alcoholism. When he finally got his own identity as War Machine, he became one of Marvel's most iconic heroes. 40 years of continuity, Avengers veteran, military precision, and heavy artillery that made him stand out from every other armored hero in the Marvel Universe. This character should have been untouchable. Instead, he died in the opening pages of Civil War II when Thanos punched through his armor and crushed him during a preemptive strike based on a psychic's vision. Just like that, 40 years of history ended so Tony and Carol could have something to argue about for 6 issues. Behind the scenes, Bendis later admitted he'd consulted Ta-Nehisi Coates before making this decision. Coates was writing Black Panther at the time, and according to Bendis, Coates warned him that killing one of Marvel's most prominent black heroes to fuel a conflict between 2 white-passing characters would look exactly like what it was. Bendis killed Rhodes anyway. This follows a pattern in how publishers calculate the value of character deaths. The ideal sacrifice is someone readers care about, but editorial doesn't need. Important enough to hurt, expendable enough to lose. When Marvel ran that calculation, their most prominent black hero landed in the expendable column. The death had emotional weight precisely because Rhodes was beloved, and Marvel used that weight to power a story about characters who got to stay alive and keep selling comics. Rhodes came back eventually because nobody stays dead in comics except Uncle Ben. But the resurrection didn't erase what Marvel's choice revealed. When they needed someone expendable enough to kill and important enough to matter, they reached for their most prominent black hero. And it wasn't even the first time. Bill Foster. 10 years before War Machine, Marvel ran the exact same play. Same event structure, same formula, different black hero. Bill Foster debuted in 1966 as Hank Pym's laboratory assistant, but understanding who he actually was reveals why his death stung so badly. Foster wasn't a sidekick. He had a PhD in biochemistry from Caltech and was brought in to solve a problem Pym couldn't crack alone. He reverse-engineered Pym's size-changing formula by 1976 and starred in his own series, Black Goliath, which ran for 5 issues before cancellation. For the next 30 years, Foster existed in a specific kind of comics limbo. Too important to forget, not important enough to headline. He worked with the Champions, teamed up with The Thing during Project Pegasus, helped the West Coast Avengers. Whenever Marvel needed a size-changing hero who wasn't Hank Pym, Bill Foster got the call. You might recognize him from Ant-Man and the Wasp, where Lawrence Fishburne played him and the film referenced Project Goliath. Then Civil War happened in 2006. And Marvel needed a death to prove the Registration Act conflict had real consequences. The event split Marvel's heroes over superhuman registration. Iron Man supported it, Captain America opposed it. Foster sided with Cap's underground resistance. In issue 4, the 2 factions clashed for the first time. And that's when Thor appeared. Except it wasn't Thor. Tony Stark, Reed Richards, and Hank Pym had secretly cloned the Thunder God using a strand of hair and a cybernetic skeleton. They called it Ragnarok. When Bill Foster charged into battle at 15 feet tall, the clone fired a lightning bolt straight through his chest and left a hole you could see through. Foster's last words were him trying to surrender. The clone wasn't programmed for mercy. This follows a pattern in event storytelling where deaths are chosen for maximum narrative efficiency. Foster's death pushed Spider-Man and Invisible Woman to switch sides, becoming the emotional turning point of the entire event. His 40 years of history were converted into plot fuel for white characters' moral reckonings, and then came the burial. They buried him at giant size because no one could figure out how to shrink his corpse. Iron Man paid for 38 burial plots. The image was meant to be tragic, but it revealed something uglier. Even in death, Bill Foster was too big for Marvel to handle gracefully. A black scientist who'd been overlooked for decades got his most prominent storyline as a corpse that didn't fit in a normal grave. His nephew Tom eventually took up the Goliath mantle, and the first thing he did was publicly denounce Tony Stark and Reed Richards as murderers. The anger felt earned because readers saw what Marvel had done, elevated a black hero just in time to kill him for a story about white characters learning lessons. Rage. Elvin Halliday was 13 years old when toxic waste transformed him into a superhuman, and his body aged into a massive adult form overnight. He looked 30, but he was still a kid inside. His grandmother told him to use his powers for good, so he chose the name Rage, marched into Avengers Mansion, and demanded membership. His first words to Captain America were a complaint about the team's lack of black members. That confrontation defines everything about Rage's existence at Marvel, because he was created in 1990 specifically to call out the Avengers' diversity problem. Writer Larry Hama designed him as a critique, a character who would force the team to confront its own blind spots. Then Marvel spent 30 years proving his point. Rage joined as a probationary member, but when the Avengers discovered he was actually a teenager, they kicked him out and transferred him to the New Warriors. His grandmother was murdered by a gang called the Poison Memories. His civilian identity got exposed. Every storyline seemed designed to take something from him. And then he'd disappear for years at a time because no writer knew what to do with a character built entirely around an accusation Marvel didn't want to address. Then came Captain America, Sam Wilson in 2016, and Rage finally had something meaningful to do. A private police force called the AmeriCops had been brutalizing communities of color across New York, funded by corporate interests, operating with impunity, targeting anyone who looked like trouble. Nick Spencer was writing this in 2016, and he wasn't being subtle. Rage confronted the AmeriCops. The confrontation went viral, and he became a symbol of resistance against police violence. For the first time in decades, Rage actually mattered. Then Marvel destroyed him. Rage was framed for a robbery he didn't commit. Captain America personally captured the real culprit, a villain named Speed Demon, and there was video evidence proving Rage's innocence. The court convicted him anyway. The judge dismissed Cap's surveillance footage as inadmissible because of how it was obtained. A black superhero, framed by a corrupt system, convicted despite proof of innocence. And then it got worse. In prison, inmates recognized Rage as the hero who'd put them away. They beat him nearly to death and left him broken in a hospital bed. Sam Wilson watched the man he'd tried to protect lying there destroyed, knowing the system had failed completely. And then Sam gave up being Captain America entirely. This follows a pattern in how black suffering gets used in fiction. Rage's brutalization existed to break Sam Wilson's faith in America. A black teenage hero was beaten into a coma, so another black hero could have character development. The trauma was never really about Rage. It was about what his trauma could do for someone else's story. Rage survived, but barely. Marvel could find him when they needed a black body to brutalize for thematic resonance. The rest of the time, he barely existed. Triathlon. Delroy Garrett wasn't killed. He got something arguably worse. He was written as a diversity hire, spent his entire run being treated like one, and then proved right about everything while Marvel sidelined him anyway. Garrett debuted in 1998 as a disgraced Olympic athlete whose steroid scandal had destroyed his career. He found purpose in the Triune Understanding, a religious organization whose leaders secretly gave him superhuman abilities. Garrett believed the Triunes had unlocked his human potential, and he became Triathlon, triple the speed and strength of a normal man. Here's where it gets painful. The Triunes launched a smear campaign against the Avengers, calling them religiously intolerant and racist. They hired Taskmaster to frame team members for destroying a Triune building. When the bad publicity became unbearable, the Avengers recruited Triathlon, not because he was qualified, but because he was black, and they needed cover. Triathlon knew exactly what was happening. He spent his entire tenure angry, suspicious, and certain his teammates only tolerated him for optics. He clashed with Iron Man constantly. He questioned every decision. The brutal irony is that he was absolutely right. This follows a pattern in representation storytelling where the accusation becomes the character's entire identity. Marvel created Triathlon specifically to explore tokenism, then made his storyline about how difficult it was to work alongside someone who felt tokenized. The Avengers got to feel put upon by his accusations. Triathlon got to be the angry black man nobody wanted around. Eventually, he proved himself during the Kang Dynasty, absorbing cosmic power, saving the universe, earning his place through heroism that couldn't be denied. But then he left the Avengers and largely disappeared. Years later, Triathlon resurfaced during Secret Invasion. His powers let him detect Skrull imposters, which should have made him crucial to a storyline about aliens infiltrating Earth. Instead, he barely appeared. His most notable action was accidentally killing Crusader, the one Skrull who was actually heroic. Marvel had a black hero perfectly suited for their alien invasion event. They sidelined him anyway. The company that created Triathlon to call out tokenism kept proving his accusations correct by treating him as expendable the moment his specific utility ended. Sync. Everett Thomas died saving the kids who bullied him. And that tells you everything about how Marvel valued Generation X's black member. Sync debuted during the Phalanx Covenant in 1994, and his power was connection. He could sync with nearby mutants and temporarily copy their abilities. In a team full of isolation and trauma, Everett was the emotional center. Chamber had no jaw. Penance couldn't speak. M carried family secrets that would take years to unravel. Everett came from a loving home with parents who fostered other children, and he kept everyone grounded. Generation X ran for 70 issues, and Sync appeared in almost all of them. He dealt with possession by the vampire Empire. He navigated a love triangle between Jubilee and Monet. He grew from uncertain teenager to confident hero across 7 years of stories. Then Emma Frost's sister Adrienne decided to destroy the Massachusetts Academy. Adrienne planted bombs throughout the school and incited anti-mutant hatred among the human students. Generation X scrambled to evacuate everyone and disarm the explosives. They found all the bombs except one. The bomb Sync discovered in a hallway where his bullies had refused to evacuate. These were the same kids who had beaten him for being a mutant, the same kids who hated him. And Everett threw himself on the bomb anyway. The blast killed him. The kids who'd brutalized him survived because he chose to protect them. Because that's who Everett Thomas was. This follows a pattern in sacrificial storytelling where black heroes are often required to demonstrate virtue by saving people who don't deserve it. Strip away the heroism, and the image is uncomfortable. A black teenager dying for white kids who hated him. His body used to prove that even racism couldn't corrupt his goodness. The narrative demanded he be better than the people who'd hurt him, even in his final moment. Generation X disbanded after his death. The book lost momentum and ended a few issues later. Marvel got their tragic ending. Sync's reward was nearly 20 years in the grave before Krakoa finally resurrected him. He came back to find his girlfriend had been resurrected without memories of their relationship. His teammates had grown up without him, and the world had moved on entirely. Being a black hero at Marvel meant dying young and coming back to discover everyone you loved had forgotten the time you spent together. Skin. Angelo Espinosa was crucified on the lawn of the Xavier Mansion by a hate group, and Marvel gave it 3 pages. Skin was one of Generation X's founding members, a Latino teenager from East LA who'd faked his own death to escape gang life. His mutation gave him 6 extra feet of gray, sagging skin that he could stretch and manipulate, but he could never hide it. Unlike most mutants, Skin couldn't pass for human. His face literally drooped off his skull. He spent the entire Generation X series making the best of it. He became best friends with Chamber, another hero who couldn't hide his mutation, since Chamber had a furnace of psionic energy where his chest and jaw should be. Together they were the guys who couldn't pretend to be normal, and they understood each other in ways nobody else could. Skin protected Jubilee from Hollywood predators. He developed a dry wit that covered genuine trauma. He was the kind of character who made you root for him because he never stopped trying, never let his appearance define his humanity. After Generation X disbanded, Skin and Jubilee moved to Los Angeles. He worked at a fast food restaurant while she chased acting gigs, 2 friends from the old days trying to build normal lives. Then he disappeared from comics entirely. 2 years later, he reappeared dead. Uncanny X-Men number 423 opened with the X-Men finding mutant bodies crucified on their front lawn. The Church of Humanity, an anti-mutant hate group, had captured and murdered several mutants as a message. Among the bodies, Skin, Magma, and Bedlam. Archangel's healing blood saved Magma. Skin was already gone. The death got maybe 3 pages. No explanation of how the church captured him. No acknowledgement of his 7 years with Generation X. No farewell from Chamber or the teammates who loved him. Just a Latino mutant's corpse on a cross, one body among several, barely mourned before the story moved on. And then it got worse. Jubilee and Husk visited his grave and discovered the cemetery was exhuming his body. Mutants weren't allowed to be buried there. The cemetery's religious beliefs prohibited sharing ground with the genetically different. His body was cremated. His ashes went to Jubilee. 7 years of character development reduced to a handful of dust and a message about hate crimes. This follows a pattern in how marginalized characters get discarded. Their deaths exist to make points about bigotry, rather than to honor who they were. Skin deserved a story about his life. He got 3 pages about his corpse. Krakoa eventually resurrected him, but the 15 years between his death and return told their own story. Marvel knew how to brutalize their heroes of color. They just didn't know how to let them live. The pattern isn't complicated. When Marvel needs someone important enough to matter and expendable enough to lose, they reach for the same roster every time, and the characters who survive are never the ones who look like this.